should this coordination institution or platform have some sort of additional mandate, meaning some sort of dissemination or capacity building functions? This is all up for discussion. It's not decided, obviously. So, whether we want to do something beyond a notice-based registry, if you will indulge me with the expression, or not. And then we will discuss also the expansion of membership of this coordination group, which we think is also a very important matter. So I will start giving the floor to my colleague from UNCITRAL, Jae Sung Lee.
Thank you. So one of the information that should be on the website, so before going to the website itself, I think one of the information that needs to be on the website is a status update on the model law. As you can see on the status page of our website, we only have assessed about 18 to 19 countries, and we have found that 9 countries have actually adopted the model law. And it is very difficult. I mean, it is difficult to actually assess whether a state has adopted a model law or not because of the so many different elements therein. And also because the information that the Secretariat has is not so up to date. Of course, we have a very small team that actually does all of the legislative work, and following up on the status of these laws is something that we need to have some support from the group as well as from you. Because if you can send us the laws that you see as a model law compliant country, from a model law country, we can then do an assessment and then be able to update that information on the website, as we have done with Marek before, because then we trust how the reform process has gone and we can understand why the deviations were there, because it's not a big jump outside of the model law, but we can understand what the deviation is and why the need was needed. So I think that is one thing that we need to gather from the UNCITRAL perspective in the information to be provided on the website. And having 9 states as a model law state is not so significant in the fact that you need a large sum of a state to become a model law country to go to the other state and say, well, you might want to consider adopting the model law. I mean, we can do that for the New York Convention. We can do that for the CISG because there is a large sum of states that have adopted the model law. And then it's a selling point actually for us to sell the model law. So I think that's one information that the UNCITRAL has to make efforts to. And we ask for any information about other states, because on the status page, you'll see that we have Australia, Colombia, Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand, which has passed the laws prior to the model law, but based on the principles of the model law. And after that, we have Fiji, Kenya, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Philippines. But if you're aware of any other law states that have adopted the model law, please let us know, and we'll do an assessment. As I said, this is a very complicated process, but we try to actually understand why they have deviated from the model law and try to upload that. And that's one thing that we'll do.
Sorry, Jay, may I stop you here by way of clarification? So how would this relate to the website or to the platform of the coordination?
Because I think one of the information that we have on the coordination page is whether a state has adopted the model law, whether the reform is ongoing, whether they're considering to adopt the model law. And as you said, it may be a notice-based system in a sense that a state actually notifies us. There has been 2 instances whether a state has notified us that they have adopted the model law. We looked at the model law, and it was not an assessment that we could say it was a positive. The other side of the coin is that it's difficult for us to say no and then to publish that information on our website, because when the status website, we only have a yes. And whether it's not a model law state, we don't indicate that, not to actually criticize or to actually shame the country. So I think that's one of the information that we need to do. And just to follow up on that, we have been asked in the Access to Credit Working Group on whether we can have a list of states that have adopted the modern registry system. Now, that's a more difficult problem because they might have not adopted the model law, but they might have a registration which kind of operates in a sense. And this is a question to the group. Whether do you think that that would be found useful, and whether that information, whether they have a modern registry but may not have the model law, is something that we should publish on the website. I don't want to go on. I have a few other things, but I think maybe we can have a discussion. Yeah.
You don't want. Okay. So one thing we'll need to discuss with the group and follow up later is whether we just provide, the platform should just provide a link to the institution whose instrument has been implemented. Yes or no, we don't know. So who goes on the merits or whether we just provide notice saying the government said that they've implemented the model law, but we can't tell because it's in Ruritanian and we don't speak Ruritanian and we don't know if it's or not. So that's one of the things we need to discuss. Okay, so first comments by Elaine now from the IFC, please.
Sure. Thanks, Ignacio, and thanks, Jay. So good morning, everybody. Good to see you all back here again. As a couple of things, maybe just to sort of step back the conversation a little bit, because I think some of you may or may not be aware that there had been established by NatLaw, and Spyridon will speak to this a few years back, this global tracker on secure transactions reform, right? So on the NatLaw website, there is this map that sort of tracks who's done what. And so I think as this new sort of working group has come together over the last 3 years, one of the things that's been the driving force of that is the need for further coordination amongst all of us and sharing that knowledge so that all of us can benefit, right? And then, of course, the beneficiaries of that, which being our clients. So if we sort of think about it in a much bigger way, at least from where I sit as, the World Bank Group, then do we want this sort of knowledge platform? How dynamic do we want that to be? Is it just going to be an information portal where we track who's done reforms and are they mapped to the UNCITRAL model law for secure transactions? And maybe we do include, is the registry a modern notice-based registry, or are they in transition from some form of paper into an automated system, on its way to being a notice-based system? So there's different sort of levels of progress that we could also put on there. But I think we need to also just sort of ask ourselves, and I think this is where it's really important that you as feedback providers to us in terms of trying to build this out so that it's a useful tool, is to say, what do we really want it to do in terms of trying to facilitate both the coordination effort that we're trying to bring to the table in this discussion as part of this working group, but as well as, do we want it to be a community of practice or where practitioners come together and share information? So is it, let's just track who's done reform in what countries and vet that against the international standards? Or do we want it to be much more dynamic in terms of sharing publications, public presentations that maybe each of our institutions have done in terms of workshops and these kinds of things, country diagnostics in terms of where is a certain country at a certain level of reform, statistical information, that kind of thing. Like, what has been the impact, the economic development impact on the economy after the reform was done? So we do some of these kinds of things. So the question I think that we need to ask ourselves, and I think would be important to hear from all of you and those of you online, is how dynamic do you want this information portal to be? And then I think once we figure out broadly those categories of information it should provide, then we can maybe figure out who should have access to what level of information, right? So I agree, I think there should be a public face to this, but there might also be just a private members only kind of access, because there might be certain information we want to make available, but we wouldn't necessarily want to make that available, writ large to the public. So maybe I'll stop there, Ignacio.
Okay, thanks. So another point for discussion, how dynamic the model law should be. And another element which is important, this is just giving notice or assessment, gatekeeping assessment as to the reform, or are we going to also share and publicize and use the platform to disseminate country diagnosis, for example, the World Bank and other institutions, like the report and observance of standards and codes and others. This could be a possibility as well. Pros and cons for the discussion. Now, the order is Jeannette Tramhel from the OAS.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Pleasure to be here. As Dante Negro had said in the opening remarks, the OAS has been supporting this initiative right from the very beginning, and we continue to support the work. I'm going to take a step back, maybe a couple of steps back here as well. He had also mentioned the recent publication, and those of you may recall, at the third conference we had on secure transactions coordination, which was in Cartagena in 2020 in February. We had been working really hard to get our publication ready and hoping that would be available for us to distribute at that conference. Unfortunately, it was not, and so I had distributed just a copy of the outline. The book was actually delivered to my office on March 12th of 2020, and as we know, a few days later, everything shut down because of the pandemic. So the books were sitting there until I returned to the office in July of this year. But every cloud has a silver lining, because as a result of that, we were able to put the work with the publisher and develop an electronic version so that it could be put online. And so many of you may have seen that publication. I hope you have already. If you haven't, it's on our website. But nevertheless, I feel as if we were deprived of this opportunity to have a great launch. And so, drum roll, please, we have now our actual print version. And I would like to take the opportunity to be able to present a copy to our institutional partners on the network, so that I have a copy for each of you. This is my little surprise that I had for you. Yeah. So one for UNCITRAL, one for the World Bank, one for UNIDROIT, and for NatLaw. So this is an institutional copy. I know that Spyros has a copy as an author. Did I get one for you too? So I have one spare, I think, as well for the library. So thank you. I was very pleased to be able to share that with you. But it also, more importantly, for the purposes of our panel, it's a segue to my comments on this topic. The book, for those of you who do not know, it's comprised of 3 parts. One part is a collection of reports. These are not official country reports, but they are reports on the status of reforms in 10 different member states by experts in the field. And then another part is what I would call an annotation of the OAS model, or the model Inter-American Law on Secure Transactions. And then the third part is a collection of different perspectives on the model law and its impact, for example, with respect to gender. And it also includes a comparative analysis by one of our panelists here, by Spyros, a comparison between the OAS model law and the UNCITRAL model law. So I think what it does is it illustrates that there's different approaches to this work, and not everyone needs to have. Some of us start with the starter home, right? We don't necessarily need to have the big mansion with 7 bathrooms. And so for some countries, the OAS model law has been a way to begin the reform process. And so the project, I think, is also illustrative of the sensitization that can take place at the regional level. Every OAS member state has received now 2 copies of this publication. And it's a bit like your high school reunion picture. Even if you didn't go to your high school reunion, you want to see who went. You want to look at that picture. So I think it is a way of encouraging and promoting reforms within the region. It also illustrates the value and the challenges of what we're trying to do, because a publication, of course, is a snapshot in time, as opposed to what we're trying to do collectively with the website. It's something that we're hoping to keep updated all the time. So that illustrates the challenge we have with that. Certainly, one of the things that we can do at the OAS Secretariat, and we have done with other instruments, we can invite member states to send us information on the status of their reforms. Not every member state will do so. So then we have that challenge of having information it's partial, it's incomplete. So how do we work with that in terms of this project now? If we want to have a link to our website with that information. We do have a specific mandate from our OAS member states to promote the model on secure transactions throughout the region. And so it's also part of a bigger mandate that we have on promoting the furtherance of private international law in the region, and to do so in collaboration with other international organizations that are active in this field, and specifically named is UNIDROIT, UNCITRAL, among others. This week, the OAS is holding its General Assembly, which is why Dante had to do his recording, give a pre-recorded remarks earlier. He's there this week. And one of the resolutions that is under consideration is the resolution on international law. Last year was the first time that that resolution contained a specific section dedicated to private international law. So it's raising the profile more and more of the work within the region. And we're expecting that this year that section will be further strengthened. So all of this is to say that the work at the regional level, such as the work in this publication, is relevant in terms of raising awareness among member states, within a political organ, of the value of this work. And then secondly, to garner their support, not necessarily in terms of funding for this work, but to gain their political support and the complementarity, so that we can move forward with trying to encourage the sharing of information on a platform such as this. So perhaps I'll leave it there with the beginning remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeannette. Thanks for the book. I see the couple Feliu Rodriguez de las Heras features prominently in it. Okay, so now we have Spiros. As I told you, we played Ignacio's video from the beginning. So it's NatLaw's second intervention this morning.
Thank you very much.
Spiros, is anyone experiencing problems accessing the internet and the Zoom connection? It's just important. Okay, can someone please talk to the... it's not working. Yeah, so something needs to reset. Please.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and I'm sorry I was late this morning. I'm not only a newcomer as a NatLaw representative, but also a latecomer for the first time in my career in these meetings. I promise will be the last. Now, I have a few minutes to just first confirm the continued support of National Law Center, both to the work on secure transactions and international trade law in general, and the coordination efforts. The change of personnel, Marek is in the room, and I can only express to him my appreciation for his work all these years. As NatLaw will continue to become involved and supportive, and be supportive of all the work of these organizations, and in particular the coordination network. Although I'm new as representative of NatLaw, I'm not new to this process, and you will allow me to share with you a few remarks, which are the result of long career with the UN and actively practicing coordination efforts. As we discussed yesterday, we have coordination in the preparation of international legislative standards. Back in the early 90s, UNIDROIT, UNCITRAL, and the Hague Conference established a relatively good coordination with annual meetings, sharing of information, participating in each other meetings, in particular in secure transactions. And secure transactions became a model of coordination in the preparation of standards, as it is reflected in their joint publication, which explains how the different secure transactions texts of these organizations relate to each other. So in the preparation of international legislative standards, I think we did well in secure transactions, and the organizations are trying to copy now the example of secure transactions in other areas of law, like international sales or arbitration or others. My only suggestion with respect to the preparation of international standards, other than we should continue participating in each other's work and participate in working group meetings and expert group meetings, would be first, to the extent there are proposals for work, and proposals are welcome, it is useful for these proposals to be accompanied with a desirability and feasibility study. Not because we are academics and we're interested in academic comparative law studies, but we want to see that there is a problem that can be resolved within a reasonable period of time by rules to be prepared by our organizations. And these will resolve actual problems vetted with member states and with industry. So a big support for desirability and feasibility studies for the preparation of legislative standards, and continued support for the coordination of these organizations, and in particular, the revision perhaps of the joint publication. Joint publication is a difficult issue these days because there is no mandate, there is no budget. In view of this difficulty, NatLaw is prepared to devote the time and accept the cost to prepare an update of the joint publication online. Of course, it will be offered to the three organizations, and they will have to decide what to do with it. But we could offer this, at least the work that needs to be prepared, and offer it in a draft form. Now, coordination in the implementation of international standards is something that over the years was lacking. And we need to do a lot to improve. First, let's say what we did well. We had joint missions where assessment studies were prepared by joint groups, including representatives of the organizations. So as an example of such a successful mission, I would mention the World Bank UNCITRAL mission to Trinidad and Tobago and St. Lucia, which led to a legislative initiative. St. Lucia is close to adopting a law. Trinidad may need a little bit more time, but they have a draft. Both countries have a draft based on the UNCITRAL model law on secured transactions. Now, it will be useful for experts drafting these laws to include representatives or experts of all organizations who know the details of these texts and share insight and information and experience together with people who have actual experience in the field and also practical experience from practicing law in that area of law. And there is another important thing on which we could improve, I think, is that representatives of all relevant organizations should bring to the attention of states where they meet the relevant international legislative standards, not just their standards, but the standards of UNCITRAL should bring to the attention of the states the standards also of UNIDROIT and OAS, and they should be mentioned in the relevant papers. Example, brilliant example of such coordination, Aaron Brojes, the General Counsel of World Bank, would not go anywhere without a copy of the New York Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards. The success of the New York Convention is due to a number of people, in particular to Aaron Brojes. If we could have other people like Aaron Brojes, that's the question. Now, coordination in capacity building. The implementation of standards is not the end, it's the beginning. Not because there is new law, but there's also new infrastructure. And there has to be a change of mind, a change of practice. Bankers have to trust the new law and lend on the basis of the new law and the new registry. The law is not enough. I was involved in studies in different countries where they have a modern secure transactions law. The benefits are not as expected because people do not know the law, do not trust the law, or have not changed the way in which they do business. So capacity building is key. Coordination and capacity building is key. And my last point is coordination in sharing of information. The joint publication I mentioned, the website, I think others before me, I heard Elaine mention it already. NatLaw would be prepared to do the preparatory work for this website, a separate website under the logos of all the organizations, with all the information per country, what country has adopted what text, based on information existing already in the websites of all the other informations, the status of texts. And then we should be building on that to provide additional information. Of course, NatLaw will not be the owner of that website, but the operator, and the operator can change from time to time. It will be owned by the members of this executive committee of this body. Any other activity, once we start improving on our work in coordination, any other activity, any new idea should be welcome to the extent that we all agree that it can improve our work. Coordination of work, of course, is a tool. The tool is the harmonization of international trade law. And we used to say in the UN, I will repeat it and I will finish with that, it is the other side of peace and stability. Development is the other side of peace and stability. And international trade law is just a stone in that building, but it is a cornerstone. And I hope that we can also make a contribution, a new contribution in that direction, which is, of course, needed these days after the pandemic and after the wars that are spreading in the world and are hanging over our heads as a threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Spyros. So let's move on then first, right now to the second round of comments. Jay?
So going back to Spyros's last point, if we were to develop a database, I wouldn't call it a website because website is the presentations of the database. I think we have to think about how we're going to feed the info into the website or the database. And I think it would be desirable to have a dynamic website. That is, of course, for sure. But that's the difficulty of actually keeping it up to date and keeping it dynamic. So the question that we probably have is whether it's feasible to do that. Now, on the information to be provided on the website, the status of their laws, the status of their registries, whether reform is ongoing, whether the relevant agency responsible for the reforms or possibly the individuals, is probably the basic information that we would want to see. Now, additional information that we may want to see is the publications like Jeannette has mentioned. Now, of course, on the UNCITRAL website, we have a link to the joint network, which contains all the links to the relevant standards. So we have a link already to all the relevant legal standards, so that can be easily done. But whether we include other publications, whether we have an update about the events that are taking place of the different organizations, and as Elaine has mentioned, whether we update PowerPoints on, providing presentations on the model law, on the receivables conventions, possibly video recordings, all of that, if that can be included on a database and on a website, that would be the ideal, desirable situation. Now, whether we can do that is a question that I'd like to pose to the group, and whether you think this is going to be something feasible.
Right. So inside this message, or within this message, or consistent with this message from Jay, is the fact that if you are going to have a database, or it is updated, or it's better not to have it, because otherwise it's misleading, and instead of giving legal certainty, undermines legal certainty. So having an updated website, which is dynamic, requires resources and requires continuous work in it. So is this a possibility? Of course, we were not here to discuss funding, but funding would be an issue, and all these things that need to be solved sooner or later. Yeah.
Just one additional proposal that I have is, since we have these coordination meetings annually, my suggestion is that we focus on one region so that we get an update from the region annually, so that we can start to compile the information about the regions. And after 4 or 5 years, at least we'll have some information from different regions so that we can go live in that time. But this is just a suggestion because we have not done a regional perspective in the coordinations forum. And if you can have a country by country analysis or a region analysis, that might actually feed into the information that we have.
Right. So you would be proposing that we have a general conference updating on the general content plus and detailed a day of the two, devoted to a region, for example, would be
A session of.
okay. Elaine.
Thank you, Ignacio and Jae. So I'm, as some of you know, I'm pretty pragmatic and practical about this kind of stuff. So, and not to go down too deeply into the weeds, but if we're looking at creating this database to be this information portal on the status of secure transaction reforms and, adoption and the tracking of that against the international standards, then the question that I'm sort of asking myself is, and it goes back to this point that Spyros made just in his closing, or just in his comments, just one of the couple of last sentences that he just mentioned was capacity building, right? So you can do all this beautiful work, as we all know, but if you can't build the capacity and the adoption doesn't take place in the country, then the effort is it's lost. And so I think one of the purposes of this type of database with this information contained in it is to build a capacity, right? So that all of us can pull from it different bits and pieces of information that we may need at different times in terms of, if we're implementing reforms on the ground, or you're trying to build the capacity of practitioners in the country, the academia in the country, senior legal counsel in a financial institution, for example, it's helpful to be able to point them to something that says, here is one portal where you can find all of the latest information that's related to secure transactions reform. And within that portal of information, there might be some learning tools for them, for example, right? So when I think of presentation material, and it might be, we as the credit infrastructure team have given a public workshop where we spend 2 days training on this new piece of legislation. And then there's, a slide deck with 60 slides in there. That might be useful to a practitioner on the ground who wasn't able to attend a workshop. So I don't want to go down to the weeds of this, but I'm trying to think of the practicality of how this as a tool can be used. And so I think we need to just figure out how do we balance that, right? In terms of the growth of this and how much depth or of information it will contain. And then, of course, that leads back to, sustainability, cost, maintenance, keeping it relevant. And all of that takes a tremendous amount of effort because, as Ignacio has said, unless it's kept up to date, then we might as well not have it. So I think from our point of view, we've got a fairly robust portfolio of projects. And so feeding into that, certainly we can commit to, at least in the portfolio of projects we're in, sharing the data that is obviously public data in terms of, these are the most recent legal reforms in terms of legislation, regulation, directives, any other secondary legislation that supports that. Whether or not that aligns to the model law, we'll be silent on that. That's up for others to judge, I think. And we don't want to give any kind of verification that it meets all of international best practices as you would map it back to the UNCITRAL model law, because in many instances, there is 80% of the model law in a lot of this legislation, but it's not very often you get 100% of adoption of all of the model law legal principles. The legal principles might be woven in there, but they may not use the language of the model law. So do we need to think about that, and what's the impact of that? And is that relevant or not? I don't know. I'm just putting that out there. I think that just going back to sort of some statistical analysis, and that information I think is helpful just in terms of tracking. The impact is also a useful bit of information to put on there as well. So maybe I'll stop there for now. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. This is very good. So capacity building as part of the mandate of the platform group or whatever it is, that means feeding the website with materials. What type of materials will be posted there, if that's what we want. legislation, but only, I would imagine, the legislation which tries to implement standards, not any legislation on secure transactions, or maybe every legislation on secure transactions, so that the people can actually go there and see whether it's updated or not and judge by themselves. We want to then maybe link part of the website with existing academic projects on secure transactions, which already provide quite a lot of information. But externally, this is some of these questions are to be answered. No, I'm just asking the questions for discussion. One element which would be very useful, but I of course realize this is not something you want to have open, is a roster of experts in countries. Maybe sometimes you need a specialist in Mauritania. It's very difficult. The World Bank normally has that information, but the rest of the world doesn't know it. But that can't be, this platform can never be a professional showcasing exercise, but maybe as part of restricted information, this is something to be discussed. But this is, I think, for a later generation using, I even forgot these Japanese cartoons, the second generation or evolution of the website. Okay, Spiros, what is it? Well, I'll remember.
Thank you, Ignacio. A couple of points. Capacity building, of course, is key, but we have to recognize its limitations. And to the extent that we are realistic, we can make a contribution. What are the limitations? I was involved in studies in countries which have adopted modern secure transactions law and yet did not see the expected economic benefits. There were economic benefits, but not as expected. 3 reasons. First, the lack of evaluation mechanism. This is not a legal issue. This is an issue of the economy, an issue of the service industry. I don't know what we can do to help that industry grow, but it is an issue. Second, enforcement. Enforcement, of course, to a large extent is a legal issue. It's not only a legal issue, but to a large extent is a legal issue. So work by these organizations on enforcement, security interest in particular, but in general, is useful. The third is the existence of secondary resale markets. Again, this is an economic issue. Law cannot do much about it. And then we have a change of mentality. Even with a new law, with a modern law, bankers do not necessarily accept inventory and receivables, the main assets that SMEs have as collateral for credit, in particular if they are future assets. So these are the limitations of capacity building. And I'm mentioning not to say that capacity building is not important, but we have to be realistic what can be achieved and what cannot be achieved. On the website, we also need a plan. These are all interesting thoughts, but we should list them and make a plan and then try to see how to best to implement that plan. So I don't know whether there is already something else that I'm not familiar with, but these are all interesting ideas which we should pursue further and come up again with what I call a desirability and feasibility study for the website. And in that, we would also assist. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Well, this panel is about that, precisely, about discussing the content. Jeannette.
Yes, well, exactly on that point. I think it is very interesting because when I recall when we were first discussing this idea, it came, I think, a bit out of that frustration, perhaps, that Ignacio was alluding to. That you would discover that, oh my goodness, here we were involved in reform, secure transactions reforms in a particular country, assisting with capacity building, and then you discover that another expert is involved in insolvency reforms or whatever. So there was sort of this idea came forward that wouldn't it be nice if there would be some way that we could coordinate this and have some sort of a database, a system whereby the organizations involved and individuals and various governments involved in reforms could go to that one place and discover whether there is reform going on or what the status of. So that was sort of the initiative, I think, that this was born out of that. And yet now we are seeing this evolution, because as we all know, the importance of capacity building is such a large one. So that would be that's a part of this question in terms of what is the objective of this database / website network that we're trying to what is the objective? I mean, there's various objectives here. Can we meet those? So just thinking out loud, one idea might be to state, if we use that idea of the website, to say, because it's fairly easy to present all of the information that was suggested earlier, the various publications and presentations and information to assist those who are engaged in developing capacity. But then at the same time, to put out the question on the website saying the network is trying. Our objective, one of our objectives is to have this map where we can, with clarity and with accuracy, identify the status of reforms across the world. It's difficult for all these reasons. So maybe we begin with just one country, and the rest of the map is blank, but at least the intention is there. And then in the meantime, all of this other capacity building work can go on while support for the initiative goes forward. So then it's both objectives can be met at once, in the sense of join us, help us, try to, fill in the rest of the map, as it were. But with that understanding that it is so difficult to have something that is current and accurate at the same time. Maybe I should just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannette. I think it's time to start the discussion with the floor. Before we reserve 5 minutes at the end to speak about membership. So just to by way of summary, to remind everyone some of the questions on the table. One of them would be, is it acceptable to go for a website with the content which has, on one hand, is respectful of the approach and the capacity of the organizations concerning the content. So for example, in case there's a model law of UNCITRAL will provide an assessment as to whether the implementation is actually enough to consider the model law implemented. So the website would just link to UNCITRAL's assessment. Other organizations, for example, what we do with Cape Town Convention, when we are notified by European member states of the transposition of Article 10 of the convention of the protocol, all we say is we've been notified by country X that they have incorporated verbatim the Article 10, the insolvency option of the protocol. We don't enter into analysis. We just channel the information and that's it. So I think the question would be, would it be fine to just clarify that the approach to the information will depend on the different organizations and it will not necessarily be the same throughout? Do we want to include country diagnostics? Do we want to enhance the mandate to capacity building? What type of information we should include in that? Well, let's just start with those and with anything that any reflections you might have. Flourish. Mark.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been one of the most exciting panels that I've ever heard from. I think the topic is really wonderful. I think the presentations. It's okay now.
I think you should talk to, because otherwise they can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe
I'm getting some feedback. You can. It's my phone.
Yeah.
Okay. The presentations have been really remarkable. Just a couple of points. As some of you know, I'm now with the International Law Institute, but I come out of the development industry, and a couple of observations. First of all, I think having a joint platform of some kind is really critical for getting the word out there, but it needs to consist, as Jay and others have mentioned, it needs to consist of tools for reform rather than just information about what reform is going on. The keys, I believe, to reform in the long term are overseas development assistance funders, and I think they have done not a great job in translating the work that you do, but for the World Bank Group. They've not done a great job in translating the work that you do into implementable practices on the ground. it's a communication issue. It's maybe attrition of the legal community away from development industries. It's a number of issues, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed because the development community really is not very aware of the work that UNCITRAL, UNIDROIT, and the Hague Conference do in particular, and the value of that work. And in often cases, are actually working at cross purposes with your organizations. I've seen it happen in a number of cases where instruments are adopted and forgotten by development professionals, where they're adopted but misapplied because the billions of dollars that are spent on development are applied elsewhere. Or in the worst case, adapted, in the case of model laws in particular, adapted by development professionals who care only about measurable legislative results rather than about implementation, which happens all too often as well. Capacity building needs to be holistic. It cannot simply be capacity building on the legislative side or on the regulatory side. It needs to be capacity building across all of the communities of stakeholders, and that's an important feature for the whatever portal is developed as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much. I have now Richard Cohn. Richard, I don't know if you're in Chicago. If that's the case, must be very early for you.
Hi, Ignacio. I'm actually in Michigan, and it's either very late at night or very early in the morning. I'm not sure which, but it's good to see everyone. I wanted to suggest that in an ideal database, which I think is a very exciting idea, a couple of things. Number one, Spiros mentioned the importance of enforcement. And I'm thinking now from the standpoint of practitioners, prospective lenders in a given jurisdiction. It would be wonderful with an ideal database to have examples of precedents where there was successful enforcement of security interests under a new law. And there was some precedent for this. Actually, NatLaw has a database that collects examples of enforcement with respect to the fideicomiso, the prenda, other security devices in Mexico. And they're doing this with the support of law firms such as my law firm, and there's a Mexican law firm involved. It's critical for lenders considering making loans in Mexico, and this could be very valuable with other jurisdictions as well. And the other thought is ultimately to have a listserv. I don't know if you thought about that or if that was already mentioned and I somehow missed it, but just a mechanism where people could actually write in and say, what information, what experience do you have with a particular country? Can you share your experience with me because I'm considering extending credit in a particular country? And that way, it's a mechanism for getting very up-to-date, current information on experiences in that country. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. So you proposing something like a interaction between those who can access the platform?
Yes, I think that ideally that would be because it's just a way for people to share experiences on a real-time basis.
Right. Thanks. Right now I have Teresa.
Thank you very much for the panel. I would like to share with you some views from a purely commercial law perspective, in particular from the idea of how platform law should be applicable to this project, because indeed it will be. And I have three comments. The first one is related to attribution and reliability of the information that will be available through this platform. This is very important because so far, when you are looking for information available and posted in an institutional website, you know that information is endorsed, is officially published by the institution, and therefore you rely entirely on that information. When this information is available in a second platform, we have to be extremely careful in guaranteeing that that information is updated, can be properly attributed, and therefore is validated by the institution that is posting. So I think that this part is really important to ensure that this second aggregating platform is going to indeed play a fundamental role as a point of reference for all the actors in the market. The second question is about liability, in the sense that these platforms required an operator of the platform. And this operator of the platform might be a kind of joint venture between all the institutions that are contributing. And in that case, is clearly a way to share liability, if I may use this purely commercial law approach here. Otherwise, we will have an actor, an operator, that is going to deal with relevant international instrument. And therefore, we might have a liability issue related to who is liable in case of interruption of the service, inaccurate information, reliance of, third party on case law available in the platform. So liability is another point that should be taken into account. And the third comment that is very positive and optimistic is that if this platform want to add value, and I'm sure that it will, aggregation is fundamental. So to have all the information available, but I would say that should add a second layer of joint project among all the different organizations. So should not be only a channel to just find the information and go directly to the organization or the institution that you are interested in, but also that there is a real cooperation among the different organizations. And this cooperation outcome is in the platform. So, for example, we have been discussing commentaries of how the different instruments interplay, how to understand in the different instrument the same concept as we were discussing yesterday, control. To which extent the ratification of the Cape Town Convention by a country in a way represent the assumption of most of the principles that are indeed in the model law on secure transactions. So this kind of analysis that, in my opinion, should be the real added value in this platform, together with this aggregation function that will be per se quite relevant nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Marek?
Thank you, Teresa, for volunteering yourself to do that kind of analysis. It's very welcome. Several comments, and I don't want to comment on every single aspect that was discussed. It was a great panel and a lot of good suggestions. And thank you, Jeannette, for reminding us of the objectives, why and how this framework coordination was actually formed many years ago, which was primarily to coordinate the efforts in the formulation, implementation, and promotion of instruments. And what we found at the time as a problem was that one institution would be funding one reform, another institution would be funding another reform, and then you end up with an UNCITRAL model law like secure transactions law, but with an English insolvency law. And that doesn't work very well together. So to me, the primary audience here are the funding institutions, because most of them don't know about these international standards, and they think, well, other country in the region reforming insolvency law along the lines of English law, so why not us? That's a good experience, it's a good law, so why don't we support it? But they don't know that there might be an international standard that works much better with their secure transactions law, and then they enact a different secure transactions law. That brings me, so whatever the information, however it is presented to me, I think those who fund reforms should be the primary target. Then what kind of information do we provide to them? Well, 2017, secure transactions, the model law was just adopted, so everyone was focusing on the model on secure transactions. But last week I was in Kenya, and we assessed the intellectual property bill that includes a section on the pledges of trademarks. So the law would have created a separate register of pledges for trademark, even though Kenya has a comprehensive secure transactions law. Similarly with warehouse receipts, they already have a registry for pledges of warehouse receipts, which came after the secure transactions law. So that basically brings out the question of what do we understand by secure transactions? To me, secure transactions is not only the model law on secure transactions, but it is all these other related instruments, including what Elaine mentioned, regulation. Because most institutions don't lend because of regulation, as well as what Richard mentioned, the case law. It's not only enforcement case law, it's all kinds of case law. There are only 2 cases in Kenya on the secure transactions law, because there hasn't been, well, I guess that's a good sign too, because there are no disputes. We did not good job with it, but it may indicate all kinds of things that may not just be, oh, this is a good job done, but a lack of use. So I think that's another item to clarify. What do we mean today by secure transactions and how far we go? And then finally, what sort of information we present? I like the idea of a dynamic database, but at the end of the day, if we have a bunch of documents, laws, regulations, assessments, someone reading that would need quick access with bullet points. Okay, this is what is happening. If our primary target are the funders and they see a bunch of information, they're probably not going to read it, frankly. So there's going to be a need for some synthesis of the information. So the person goes into a website, sees, okay, this is what is happening in Ghana today. These are the ongoing reforms. These are ongoing workshops and events. And based on that, I can take some action. If I want to read the law, yes, there is a link to a law, but we can't just have a lot of information on the website about ongoing initiatives without providing some kind of a synthesis of it. So I think I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marek. Very interesting. So we agreed yesterday preparing in executive committee meeting, preparing this conference, that each chair would make sure that each panel has a summary of a couple of paragraphs. But I would suggest, and unfortunately for Will and others, that this panel actually is quite comprehensive in the summary. So we'll try to make a list of the ideas that have been shared by all participants, so that we really have a script for discussion in some detail going forward. I have now Jerry.
Thank you very much. We're listening with a lot of interest at the Hague conference in relation to this coordination platform, not just in relation to secure transactions, but in terms of what it can mean going forward. Many thanks, of course, to the OAS in particular. We did have finally private international law mentioned last year. It was something that was important to us, but it also showed us how unknown the work of the Hague conference is to various different parties and stakeholders. So I want to start on that point, which is that the Hague conference is very interested in this secure transactions platform. And we do want to make sure we can, in some capacity, contribute to this, not just for secure transactions, but if it does go further as well. Now, having said that, in-house at the Hague conference, we also considered what this would mean, having a small secretariat and very limited resources. And I wanted to perhaps reiterate what Elaine mentioned on the matter of sustainability. We have quite a few databases and platforms that we're running for different projects in the Hague conference. And these sort of platforms and portals are a bit like wars, right? They're very easy to set up, very hard to maintain. So easy to start a war, very hard to carry on with it. And the sustainability point, I think, is really important in terms of donor contribution and so on as well. And that also brings me to the next point in relation to the databases that we have. What Teresa said about validation and attribution is really important. So we do have a database of case law for specific topics that the Hague conference deals with. The one that comes to mind most obviously is the child abduction database. It's really difficult to keep that up to date. And because it is not up to date, a lot of people don't use that database, which then starts this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of a database that cannot be kept up. And so nobody uses it and donors don't want to fund it and so on. So I would perhaps urge caution there. I like the idea of a dynamic database, one that's mobile friendly and one that is, has synthesis would be important. But I think there, again, we're going to run into some issues in terms of the UI, UX, the user interface and user experience for this portal. And here, with the indulgence of this panel, I work in private international law now, and I come from a different background. I used to work in space. And about 20 years ago, I consulted for the World Bank, where there was a gateway. Forgive me, Ignacio, I mentioned this to you already. There was a portal that was meant for development law, actually, and it was called the Development Gateway. It was too much to too many. So it intended to have a public-facing thing. It had a private-facing thing as well. There were parts that were secure. There were parts that were not. It was intended to be mobile-friendly, network of networks. It was a lot of things to a lot of people. What's wonderful about that project was that it did take off. I think it was founded in 1999 by the World Bank president at the time, Wilkinson, perhaps, and then was put out to a foundation as a private kind of initiative. And then the OED of the Operations Evaluation Department of the World Bank did a very good report on it. Perhaps a bit tangential to what we're talking about, but we're coming at it from the same angle. We're trying to be a lot of things to a lot of people. And I would perhaps urge a little, I wouldn't say caution, but at least awareness that being so much tends to dilute what can be done. It also tends to dilute donor motivation in terms of getting this up and running. I did like all the things that have been brought up. So we have so far in the last 20 minutes brought up events, initiatives, lists of experts, case law, listservs. The list goes on. It's wonderful. But then the matter is, of course, how do we keep this up to date? And the worst thing that can happen is that it falls into disuse tool before we even get the thing done. But that said, again, if I might just go back, the Hague Conference is very interested in this. And of course, we would support this in terms of whatever we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. This is great. Of course, this is just to throw ideas out there and then for some of them to be discarded, at least temporarily, until we have. Yes, we have Bob Trojan.
Thank you. What a great panel. This is a very exciting topic. And I'd like to underscore a lot of the comments that people have said. I'd like to spend my time today just highlighting something that Jerry from Hague showed us yesterday, which was what they're doing having to do with judges. And so what I see this conversation is how do we connect our community, so the secure transaction community, and using something different than a database, than a website. So this is, I see, a platform for our community. And so what Jerry showed us yesterday was what they're doing with judges. And so having the community of judges, having a platform to communicate. And I'd see one of the very important uses of this network is to use something like Slack or Microsoft Teams or something like that for us all to be speaking with one another. And if we're not using it, why should someone else be using it? And so I would also ask that someone under 30 years of age be in charge of it. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm too busy to do that. Spiros, this is the last word on this, and then we'll talk a bit about membership.
Thank you very much. 100% support on the website and sharing of information, but a note of caution. In my early days in UNCITRAL, which started in the early 90s, the coordination paper of UNCITRAL was a study longer than 100 pages. It included everything. Then why wasn't coordination so successful? Because organizations have different mentalities, different policies, different budgets, different agendas. Sharing of information is important, but we should not lose sight of the need to have a change of mind, a change of culture. The World Bank, for example, for years were keeping saying that it's not for us to recommend international standards to any state. We tailor our recommendations to the needs of a state. If they ask us, we will answer, but the donors want to have their hands free, what they want to recommend, and it has to be country by country. So sharing of information, yes, but we need to use that as a tool for a change of culture, a change of mind, real coordination. Thank you.
So we need a psychiatrist to remember that. Okay, so in the meeting yesterday, we also discussed membership, and we were convinced that it makes sense to enlarge the community, and so to institutionalize some of you, to enfranchise some of you and bring them permanently onto the platform beyond just attending the conferences once a year. Maybe, would you like to elaborate a little bit, Jae?
Well, actually, currently we have 5 members that you see on the podium. I hear from Jerry that Hague Conference may be interested in joining the network. So I hope that is something that we can pursue with the Hague Conference. But we'd also like to actually invite other regional agencies that are active in secure transaction reform. We know that ADB also has a project on secure transactions. We know that APEC is also, I mean, APEC, it's a little bit difficult in an institutional perspective to join, but we would like to invite APEC, and we would also like to invite IADB from the Latin American region, but we're looking for like EBRD. So all these development banks, regional development banks, because if they are becoming a member, of course, becoming an executive committee member is a different issue. But if they can become a member, and we would like to enlarge our membership so that we share not only information among us and the conference participants, but they're constantly in communications with the bigger audience, and that would also feed into the information that will be provided on the platform.
So we have the World Bank, which is a global international financial institutions. We'd really like to have the regional international financial institutions. EBRD is here, ADB is here, but we'll reach out to the IDB, to the African Development Bank, and so on. Those are very clear candidates to be invited, and we hope you will agree to it. And then reaching out to states as well, states organizations, so we can actually cast the net and incorporate state feedback into the site. We also received a proposal from the International Law Institute to join the network. And we are very happy to welcome the International Law Institute because we are very much aware of their personal capacity and the work they've been doing since the very beginning with this project, which in part was founded with the energy and the ideas of Marek, who's now with the International Law Institute. So I think everyone would agree that this is a very important addition. Anyone would like to add anything or any comments from the floor? Okay, then coffee it is, I think, isn't it? Not yet? No, it's not a panel. Okay, well, too bad. Right. So please join me in thanking everyone who participated in this panel, and an applause to yourselves as well.